Okay, team. So we're looking at the second set of literary devices in our packet, and we're starting with imagery, which is a term that most of us are pretty familiar with and pretty comfortable with. And on the most basic level, imagery is just an appeal to the senses, and that can be smell, taste, touch, visual, sight, or hearing. And I want to offer an important point of clarification because a lot of times students think of imagery or have been told that imagery is just anything that you can visualize, which is actually a very weak definition for imagery. Imagery, as that definition states, is an appeal to any of those senses. So if it's a description that appeals specifically to the sense of smell, that's still imagery, but it's not, of course, going to be anything that you can see. So we've covered our three major examples that you're most likely to see: your visual, auditory, and tactile. Visual, he would dash so hurriedly that his necktie flew back over his shoulder to the yellow brick building with its tall smokestack and wide playing fields where he taught. And in that description, we've got a variety of words that are doing the majority of work to generate the image. We have the yellow brick building, the tall smokestack, the wide playing fields doing the majority of the work. Of course, there are other pieces, such as the idea of dashing and the necktie going over the shoulder. And those are appeals to imagery as well. For auditory, we have an example that relies on a lot of onomatopoeia, but there are other things going on in this as well. The woman sat and listened to a soundtrack, chugga 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 chugga, the metronomic rhythm of an Amtrak rolling down the line to California, a sound that called to mind an old camera reel moving frames of images along a linear track, telling a story. And so there, of course, we have the onomatopoeia of chugga chugga, but we also have the phrase metronomic rhythm, and we have the idea of this sound of the train. And in the second part of it, in the second half of it, we have that description of an old camera reel, which you're going to be less familiar with today, but it used to be that before digital cameras, you had cameras where you loaded film into them. In fact, some of you in film class may still use these, where you actually have to wind the camera after each picture, and you have this kind of clicking sound that goes along with it, this repetitive clicking sound. And then with tactile, very simple example, but a pretty easy one, standing barefoot on a sandy beach. And there, your primary words doing the work are, that of barefoot and sandy. And I think it's probably pretty safe to say that we've all had the sensation of having sand between our toes. And so that's our appeal to the sense of feeling. So we go from there onto irony. Irony can be a tough one because irony is something that we understand to work in a couple of different ways. And our definition here is primarily for situational irony. And our definition is a special kind of contrast between appearance and reality, usually one in which reality is the opposite of what it seemed. And that's going to be a different definition than dramatic irony, which we'll be worried about later. So if you want to make yourself a little note that definition is for situational irony. Our example here is one from a few centuries ago. In the 19th century, many scientists wrote about racial superiority and the biological differences between Caucasians and other races, but many of these so-called scientists had never met or seen or even studied an individual of another race. And the irony there is, there's a couple of things going on. One, to actually be a scientist, you have to apply the scientific method, which these individuals weren't doing. Two, the thing that they were supposed to be an expert on, they had never actually studied, never had any actual encounter with. And so you had these people who were just saying things without any knowledge whatsoever, calling themselves scientists. And so the irony there is the application of that term scientist, which we really ought to have scare quotes around to these individuals. Our next one is juxtaposition. And our definition is the side-by-side placement of sentences or ideas for the purpose of contrast, comparison, rhetorical effect, suspense, or to highlight a point. And so basically juxtaposition is just you're putting two things right next to one another so that you can more easily see how they are similar or how they are different. And as a result of that, we often see juxtaposition used with repetition and parallelism, or one or the other, not necessarily both. And our example here is the quiet whispers of friends and the loud sounds of crowds. And there we have we have a couple of different things going on. We have the juxtaposition of the type of sounds, the quiet whispers versus the loud sounds. We also have the juxtaposition of friends with crowds, the familiarity of people that you know and like versus the strangeness and the unknown individuals of a crowd. So we move to another pair of terms from there, two terms that you may be unfamiliar with, and that's okay, no worries. Most of these have been pretty familiar to us so far, so that's good. Metonymy and synecdoche. Metonymy is a figure of speech in which a word referring to one attribute of something is used to signify the whole. And so our example here is the crown is used to signify the monarchy. The idea of referring to the crown decides to do this would mean that a king had decided to do something. Or he's taken to the bottle means he's taken to drinking. And that moves us to synecdoche, which is a type of metonymy in which a part is made to stand for the whole or a whole for the part. And so that's pretty easy to understand, right? Because a part of a thing is, of course, going to be associated with it. And that's why synecdoche is a subset of metonymy. And our example here is all hands on deck. Hands stands in for the actual soldiers, and I'm hoping that that example actually reminds us of one that we've already seen so far during Of Mice and Men, when we had Steinbeck using that hand motif, and every time we saw a description of the hands, it became emblematic of the character that we were looking at in that particular example. And from there we go to motif, which we were just talking about, and that's a recurring structure, pattern that helps to develop a theme within a work. Sometimes I will describe a motif as kind of the building blocks, or some of the building blocks, that an author is going to use to build a larger structure that we would think of as a theme. And so we have a few examples, a motif of birds, such as seagulls flying high, a boat named the Lark, the eagle a character sees in the mountains, and all of those might underscore the theme of freedom, or, as we were just saying, the use of hands and of mice and men, where the hands become indicative of the character we're looking at. So that's pretty easy. And we'll move ahead to parallelism, which is one of two terms that students sometimes struggle with just a little bit, only because it's similar to repetition. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But our definition for parallelism is the use of recurrent similarity, a sentence structure, an adjective, direct object, dependent clause, etc. And when parallelism shares elements with repetition, but the two are not the same. A sentence might use both, but where repetition is usually reserved for words or phrases, parallelism can extend to entire paragraphs or sections. And the way that you might see that work, and we'll look at a sentence example in a moment, but in a paragraph, if we have two parallel paragraphs, the first sentence of both paragraphs might do the same thing. So sentence 1 in both paragraphs is dedicated to doing thing A, and the second sentences do the same thing B, and so on down the line. And when you're setting up two paragraphs similarly like that, you are in fact actually using this practice of parallelism. Now, ideally, of course, you're also doing similar things with the sentences within those paragraphs. But let's look at our real simple example here down at the bottom. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And that's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. And in the quote, Lincoln's doing a few things. So we can see that each kind of iteration of the phrase begins with, you can fool all of the people some of the time. And so we actually have two descriptions of that. Although in the second one, it's not you can fool, it's you cannot fool. And from there, we'll turn our attention to all the people some of the time. And we have the quantity of the people and the amount of the time that they can be fooled. And so all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, and all of the people all the time. And in that way, we get to see parallelism in a couple of different ways in this particular example. Personification, real simple one, not one that we normally have trouble with. It's just a figure of speech in which human qualities are given to an object, animal, or idea. In our example here, Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing through all her works, gave signs of woe. Earth, of course, does not feel wounds. nature does not have a chair that she sits in, nor does she sigh, nor does she do works, and of course she's not going to give signs of woe, a distinctly human emotion. So that is our pause for this particular section. And all I'm going to ask you to do is go back through and in this round again, do the same thing that you did with the last one. Give those terms a smiley face, a neutral face, or an unhappy face based on how you feel about them so far. Once you've done that, just go ahead and start the third set.